The terminal was loud with rolling suitcases, boarding calls, and the chatter of travelers hurrying to their gates. Then the sound shifted, the way it does when something crosses the invisible line of ordinary. Conversations faltered, footsteps slowed, and eyes turned toward Gate 47. A uniformed officer's hand clamped down on the shoulder of a woman who had been walking toward the boarding line. Without warning, he spun her halfway around, and his fist tangled in her hair. A sharp tug yanked her head back, strands pulling against her scalp with a force that made people gasp aloud. A mother shielded her child's eyes. Phones flew up into the air, recording every second. The clicking beads at the ends of her braids rattled against one another like a warning bell that no one in authority seemed to hear. The woman didn't scream. She didn't plead. Her silence was louder than any shout. Her stillness carried a weight that unsettled everyone watching. She was dressed with the elegance of someone who had long stopped trying to prove her worth. Charcoal suit, leather carry-on at her side, a posture too assured for the accusations thrown at her. "Ma'am, you need to comply," the officer barked, voice echoing across the tiled floor. His grip stayed locked in her hair, his tone suggesting command, but his eyes betrayed something else. Annoyance, maybe even resentment, that she dared hold herself with dignity while under his hand. A teenager near the seating area whispered, "Why is he pulling her hair? She didn't do anything." No one answered. No one ever answers quickly in moments like this. Some stared outright, others turned away, pretending not to see. But the phones didn't look away. They stayed raised, their lenses capturing the clash between authority and injustice. The woman steadied her breath. Her chin lifted despite the grip dragging against her scalp. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was defiance. The kind that unnerves men who expect obedience. A hush fell heavy across the space, the sound of her braids rattling the only noise cutting through the tension. "Suspicious activity," one officer muttered, though his explanation carried no detail, only a justification for what everyone already knew didn't add up. Suspicious activity? On what grounds? No theft, no violence, no threat. Just a woman with skin darker than theirs, and a presence they couldn't seem to reconcile with belonging in the first-class line. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances. A man in a business suit shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. A grandmother pressed her palm over her mouth, eyes wide, torn between horror and helplessness. Each second felt longer than it should, as though time itself had slowed to watch the humiliation unfold. The officer's hand tightened again, forcing her a half-step backward. Her carry-on toppled sideways, spilling a leather folder across the floor. Papers fluttered. No one bent to help. People just watched. And in that breathless pause, her voice cut through the air, low but steady. "Take your hand off me." The officer smirked, still gripping. "You're not in charge here." But those words, spoken too loudly, too carelessly, made the crowd stir. A ripple passed through the travelers holding their phones. The phrase echoed as if mocking itself. Not in charge here. Little did he know, the woman whose hair he clutched had the power to reroute entire empires with a single call. She could raise companies to the sky or bring them down to their knees overnight. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to wrestle free. All she needed was that stillness, that quiet certainty in her eyes, the unflinching gaze that told anyone watching that he had no idea who he had just touched. And in that silence, as the beads at the end of her braids clicked together once more, the question burned in every witness's mind. Who was this woman? And what was about to happen to the airline that thought they could humiliate her? Before we continue, make sure to hit subscribe so you never miss these powerful, real stories. And let me know in the comments, what country are you watching from right now? She didn't move. She didn't struggle. She simply locked eyes with the officer, the weight of her entire empire behind that stare. And when she finally spoke again, the words carried enough force to change the future of a $10 billion deal. The day began not with chaos, but with order. At the Williams estate, the sun spilled across polished marble floors, the house alive with quiet rhythm. Elise Mensah was already awake before dawn, as always. Discipline had carried her this far, through medical school, through investment wars on Wall Street, through the creation of Williams Global Ventures. That discipline was stitched into her mornings like thread through fabric. She sat at the edge of her glass-top desk in the study, a fountain pen in hand, notes neatly lined in a leather journal. Her staff often joked that she could run a global empire with nothing more than black ink and unshakable focus. This morning, though, the stakes were higher than usual. At noon, she would finalize the $10 billion investment in Meridian Airlines, an agreement meant to transform their outdated fleet into one of the most advanced in the skies. In the kitchen, her daughter Zara padded in, still wearing a robe, braids hanging loose over her shoulders. At 14, Zara was quick-witted, impatient with silence, and always ready to remind her mother she was more than just a CEO. "You've been at it since 5, she said, leaning against the counter. "You should rest, even if it's only for 10 minutes. Elise didn't look up immediately. She finished her note, closed the journal, and only then answered. "Rest doesn't build futures, my love. Consistency does." "But futures don't collapse if you drink tea on the porch for once," Zara shot back, arms crossed, that spark in her tone Elise recognized as her own. Elise allowed a thin smile. Her daughter's defiance was not rebellion, it was inheritance, the same stubborn belief in one's right to occupy space, to speak, to push back against the world. "One day," she said softly, "you'll learn that rest can feel like weakness to those who've had to fight for every inch of respect." Zara frowned, but didn't argue. She knew better than to mistake her mother's words for exaggeration. She had seen enough already. Whispers at restaurants, dismissive looks from hotel clerks, a subtle tilt of voices that softened only when Elise signed a check big enough to command obedience. Marcus, her husband, entered then, adjusting the cuff of his shirt. He had long since traded investment banking for managing the family's household, but his sharp mind never left him. He set a steaming mug beside Elise. "Tea, not coffee. Your daughter's request." Elise raised a brow at Zara, who only shrugged. "Even billionaires need antioxidants," the girl said. There was laughter then, a brief moment of warmth that filled the kitchen. But it passed quickly as Elise's phone buzzed. A message from her assistant, Caroline. "Meridian board call confirmed. Press wants statement afterward. Reminder, Palmer still hedging on emissions timeline." Elise's jaw tightened. Jeffrey Palmer, Meridian's CEO, had been dragging his feet on environmental commitments for months. To Elise, sustainability wasn't a bargaining chip. It was necessity. Too many corporations had treated communities of color like collateral damage in their expansion. Smog choking Harlem, chemical runoff poisoning towns in Louisiana, airports built with no thought for the neighbors whose lungs would bear the cost. She would not sign her name to another empire that treated dignity as optional. When she joined Marcus and Zara for breakfast, she was already shaping her message for Palmer. The table gleamed with plates of fruit, fresh bread, and eggs Zara had insisted on making herself. Elise's mind was still on the deal, but she forced herself to pause when her daughter nudged her wrist. "Mom, listen to me," Zara said, serious now. "You tell everyone else they have to treat people right, or they don't get your money. Promise me you won't bend on that today. Not even a little." Elise reached across the table, covering her daughter's hand with her own. "Dignity is non-negotiable. I'll never bend on that." Her voice was firm, but she didn't know then how those words would haunt her within hours. By 9, the estate was in full motion. Drivers prepared the car, assistants confirmed schedules, Caroline called in with last-minute updates. Elise moved through it all with that serene authority that made even the most chaotic morning feel orderly. She double-checked her notes, adjusted the scarf at her neck, and kissed Zara on the forehead before stepping toward the waiting vehicle. Zara followed her to the door. "You always say business teaches people who you really are. What if Meridian doesn't like who you are?" Elise turned, her eyes steady, her voice unflinching. "Then they'll learn they can't afford to ignore it." She left with her carry-on in hand, unaware that within hours the same company courting her billions would try to strip her dignity in front of hundreds. Unaware that their mistake wouldn't just cost them a deal, it would ignite a reckoning in an airport terminal where silence could no longer shield injustice. The black sedan pulled up smoothly to the departure terminal, its tinted windows reflecting the morning rush. Elise stepped out, heels clicking softly against the pavement. She moved with the poise of someone who had trained herself to own every space she entered. Her charcoal suit fit perfectly, her hair in a polished twist, a silk scarf at her neck catching the morning light. To most, she looked like success embodied. But to the eyes waiting inside, her presence would trigger something else entirely. She crossed the sliding glass doors into the terminal, the hum of rolling suitcases and intercom announcements enveloping her. Business travelers hurried past, families clustered near luggage carts, flight attendants swept by in uniformed formation. She walked through it all with calm efficiency, her carry-on balanced lightly in her hand. Yet, almost instantly, the shift began. A cluster of security personnel near the checkpoint glanced her way. Their eyes lingered longer than necessary, sliding up and down as though trying to square her tailored presence with some unspoken suspicion. One leaned toward another, muttering something under his breath. The other smirked. Elise caught it all without acknowledging them. She'd lived this routine too many times. At the counter, the agent gave her the sort of smile that didn't reach the eyes. "First-class check-in?" he asked, though her boarding pass clearly bore the mark. Yes, the pause before he scanned it was just long enough to make the people behind her shuffle. He tapped the screen harder than needed, then forced a brightness into his tone. "All set." But Elise saw the slight shake of his head after she walked away. The small things stacked quickly. A woman in line behind her whispered to her companion, "How does someone like her afford that ticket?" The words weren't meant for Elise's ears, but they landed all the same. A businessman at the cafe turned his head a fraction too slowly when she passed, his gaze hovering as if measuring her against a stereotype he couldn't discard. These were the cuts before the wound. Not sharp enough to draw blood on their own, but relentless in their repetition. She approached security, placing her carry-on on the belt with practiced movements. The officer manning the scanner looked at her, then at the ID she handed over, then back at her. His silence dragged longer than it should have. Elise's jaw tightened, but she remained composed. "You're traveling alone?" he asked finally. "Yes." "Business or personal?" The question was unnecessary. Her boarding pass didn't require that detail, but the tone made it clear he wanted to hear her say it. Elise held his gaze, steady, unflinching. "Business." The officer studied her once more, then waved her through. His eyes, though, followed her until she disappeared into the line for boarding. Near the gate, a man seated with his laptop looked up as she approached. Their eyes met for a second. His expression wasn't hostile, only uneasy. The sort of look that says, "I see what's happening, but I won't get involved." He lowered his gaze to his keyboard, fingers typing faster, his silence louder than any protest. That silence framed everything. The whispers, the lingering stares, the unnecessary questions. They thrived in silence. It wasn't the noise of confrontation that kept them alive, but the quiet acceptance of those who knew better and still did nothing. Elise adjusted the strap of her bag and sat in the waiting area, her posture regal, her face unreadable. But inside she felt the familiar sting of recognition. She had billions under her control, corporations waiting on her decisions, governments eager for her partnership. And still, in this space, she was not CEO, not investor, not builder of futures. She was just another black woman subject to suspicion, diminished by looks that asked what right she had to sit where she sat. Her phone buzzed. A message from Airline. "Board expects confirmation of deal by evening. They'll release a joint statement once you sign." Elise typed back. "Hold statement, not yet." She didn't know why she hesitated, but something in the air told her the day would not go as smoothly as the board imagined. She slipped her phone back into her bag, folded her hands in her lap, and lifted her chin. If dignity was non-negotiable, then she would carry it into this terminal, no matter how many eyes tried to strip it from her. Moments later, a security officer began walking toward her, his gaze already narrowed. The storm she hadn't yet seen was about to break. The officer's shadow fell across Elise before she even looked up. His boots stopped just inches from her carry-on, his stance wide, chest puffed out like he was about to make an example of someone. She raised her eyes slowly, her face neutral, her posture steady. "Ma'am," he said, though the word carried no respect. "I'll need to see another form of identification." She offered her boarding pass and passport, both already in his hand. He didn't even glance at the details. Instead, his eyes stayed fixed on her face, searching for a reason to doubt. "That card you used at the gift shop raised a flag," he continued. "Premium accounts like that don't usually belong to minors traveling alone." Elise tilted her head, her voice calm. "I'm not a minor, and the card is mine. You already have my ID." He smirked, unmoved. "You're telling me you're the authorized holder of a platinum executive account tied to Williams Global Ventures?" The way he said it carried disbelief, as if her skin made such a connection impossible. "Yes," she replied evenly. "I am." She reached into her bag, withdrew her company badge, and placed it in his hand. The polished card gleamed under the overhead lights. Dr. Elise Mensah, founder and CEO. To anyone else, it would have been enough. To him, it was nothing. "Anyone can print a badge," he said flatly, tossing it back onto her bag without even inspecting it. A low murmur rippled through the waiting area. Passengers shifted in their seats, phones rose higher, recording every second. Elise sat straighter, her chin lifting. "You have what you need. Let me through." But he wasn't finished. He leaned closer, voice dropping just enough to sting. "Or maybe you're using someone else's identity. Happens all the time." Gasps slipped from the people nearest. A woman clutched her child closer. A man muttered, "Unbelievable." Still, no one moved. Elise's patience thinned, but her composure never cracked. "That is my name. That is my company, and you will remove your hand from me right now." Instead of complying, he reached forward. His fingers tangled roughly in her braids, yanking her head back so sharply that she winced. The beads at the ends of her hair clicked together, the sound piercing the silence like tiny alarms. The terminal erupted in a collective gasp. Someone shouted, "Let her go." Another whispered, "This is wrong." Yet the officer held on, his face hardening as though doubling down on his authority. Elise steadied her breathing. Her heart raced, but her voice remained calm, each word deliberate. "Take your hand off me." Her command cut through the noise like glass, but he ignored it. "You don't tell me how to do my job." His grip tightened, pulling her another half-step backward. Her scarf slipped from her neck and fell to the floor. Phones captured everything. The smirk on his face, the pain in her posture, the braids swinging against her cheeks. And above all, the unwavering stillness of a woman who had been underestimated one time too many. In the front row of onlookers, a businessman leaned forward, conflicted. He muttered to no one in particular. If she were white, they'd be asking for an autograph, not an ID. His voice shook, but he didn't rise to intervene. Silence still outweighed courage. Elise's daughter, seated a few gates away, saw the commotion and froze, her eyes wide, her breath caught in her throat. The image of her mother, a billionaire, a builder of futures, reduced to this humiliation seared into her memory in an instant. And still, Elise refused to shout. Her stillness carried more power than rage could. Every second of silence, every inch of dignity she refused to surrender, made the officer look smaller, crueler, more desperate. Around them, the murmurs swelled into outrage. "This isn't right." She showed her ID. "He's out of line." The crowd's voices grew louder, the tide shifting. Yet the officer clung on, blind to the fact that the ground beneath his employer was already crumbling. Because in that moment, as Elise locked her gaze on him with the quiet certainty of someone who knew her worth could never be touched by his hands, Meridian Airlines lost more than a customer. They lost $10 billion. From across the terminal, Zara Mensah sat frozen in her seat, the science magazine she'd been reading sliding unnoticed to the floor. Her eyes locked on the crowd gathering at Gate 47. At first, she couldn't see clearly what was happening. Only the raised phones, the sharp edge of voices, the restless shifting of passengers. Then the mass of bodies parted slightly, and she saw it. Her mother's head jerked back by a stranger's hand, braids yanked so roughly they swayed against her cheeks. The sight was unthinkable. Elise Mensah wasn't just Zara's mother. She was the woman who spoke on international stages, who ran boardrooms full of men twice her age, who could silence arrogance with a single glance. At home, Elise had always been steady, never flinching, never bending. And now, in the middle of a crowded airport, someone reduced her to an object, something to be handled, doubted, dragged. Zara's throat closed. She wanted to scream, to shove her way through the crowd, to tear that officer's hand from her mother's hair. But her body betrayed her. Her knees trembled, her hands clutched the armrest, nails digging into the fabric. Fear pressed down hard, pinning her in place. All around her, adults murmured. Some whispered that the officer had gone too far. Others simply watched, eyes wide, mouths tight, waiting for the spectacle to unfold. Nobody intervened, nobody pulled him back. And that silence pierced Zara more deeply than the officer's grip itself. It told her what she was too young to forget. People would rather watch injustice than risk being touched by it themselves. Her chest burned as tears welled up, but even then she remembered her mother's rule: never let them see you cry. She blinked furiously, her vision blurring and clearing, until she could focus again on Elise. And what she saw nearly broke her heart. Because Elise wasn't fighting, she wasn't shouting, she wasn't thrashing against the officer's grip. She stood rooted, still as stone, her chin lifted, her eyes locked forward. That calm wasn't surrender. It was defiance. And when Elise finally turned her gaze toward her daughter, Zara understood. Their eyes met through the crowd, a mother and daughter bound by an unspoken language. Elise's expression didn't say, "Help me." It didn't say, "Run." It said, "Watch. Learn. This is what they will do to us. And this is how you stand through it." The message seared into Zara's mind like fire. Generational trauma, passed not through words but through the weight of survival. Elise had told her stories about hospital rooms where her authority had been questioned, about board meetings where her expertise was dismissed until a man repeated it. But this wasn't a story told at the dinner table. This was happening now, unfolding in real time, in front of strangers holding cameras like shields. Zara's breathing grew shallow. The humiliation was unbearable, but so was the pride swelling against it. Her mother, head yanked, dignity stripped, still looked like a queen. Even in pain, Elise was teaching her daughter resilience, refusing to surrender the only thing they could never afford to lose: self-respect. Passengers murmured louder now, some calling out for the officer to stop, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Zara glanced around, hoping someone, anyone, would act. A businessman stared but stayed rooted to his seat. A woman pressed a hand to her mouth but said nothing. A young couple whispered to each other, eyes darting between Elise and the officer, but they didn't move. The silence of bystanders carved itself into Zara's heart. She would remember that silence for the rest of her life. She would remember how the world had watched her mother's dignity assaulted and chose to look away. Her hands finally unclenched. She stood, legs shaking, ready to push through the crowd. She didn't know what she could do, but she couldn't just sit any longer. Then Elise's eyes met hers again, a tiny shake of her head, just enough to tell her, "Stay. Do not risk yourself. I can endure this." Zara froze once more, tears brimming but unshed. The lesson was clear. Resilience wasn't always about striking back. Sometimes it was about refusing to bow even when the world tried to strip you bare. She sank back into her seat, her chest heaving, her nails biting into her palms. The image of her mother's braids pulled tight burned into her vision, a memory that would never fade. And as the officer tightened his grip once more, Zara understood something no teenager should have to learn so young. In America, even power, wealth, and brilliance couldn't always shield black bodies from being treated as disposable. For a moment, time seemed suspended. The officer's grip lingered in her hair, the crowd's gasp still hanging heavy in the air. Then Elise straightened, slowly, deliberately, forcing him to release her or risk looking like he was wrestling a woman who refused to resist. Her scarf lay crumpled at her feet, but she ignored it. She lifted her chin, smoothed her suit jacket with one steady motion, and stood taller than the officer who had tried to break her dignity. Her voice cut cleanly through the noise, low but steady. "My name is Dr. Elise Mensah, founder and chief executive officer of Williams Global Ventures." A ripple of whispers swept through the gate area. Some passengers lowered their phones, then quickly raised them again, realizing this moment was no longer just a confrontation, it was history being documented. The officer scoffed, unmoved. "Ma'am, you can claim whatever you want. I don't have to take your word for it." Elise didn't flinch. She held out her company badge once more, the silver lettering catching the harsh overhead lights. "You don't have to take my word. You only have to read." He glanced at it again, dismissively, and shook his head. "Like I said, anyone can make one of these." His tone was laced with the same disbelief that had trailed her since she walked into the terminal. The disbelief that a black woman could stand at the top of global finance. Phones zoomed closer. A man in a gray suit whispered to the woman beside him. "That's her. That's Elise Mensah. She runs the firm with billions under management." Another voice, shaky with outrage, added, "I read about her in Forbes. They're dragging a billionaire like she's a criminal." The crowd stirred, voices growing louder. Yet the officer pressed on, unwilling to cede authority. "Until we verify this, you'll remain where you are." Elise's calm only deepened. "Verify it then. Call your supervisors, call the airport board, call Meridian Airlines themselves. Their CEO is expecting me today. I assure you they will answer." The officer shifted, his confidence faltering for a fraction of a second. Around them, travelers leaned closer, their cameras recording every detail. The steel in Elise's voice, the arrogance etched across his face, the imbalance between a woman demanding dignity and a man clinging to control. Another officer, younger and less sure of himself, stepped closer and whispered nervously, "Sir, maybe we should." "Stay back," the first barked. His pride had taken the wheel now, steering him further into the abyss of his own prejudice. Elise bent, retrieved her scarf, and draped it calmly around her neck. She adjusted the knot with the precision of a surgeon preparing for an operation. Every movement was measured, controlled, intentional. Her dignity, restored by her own hands, stood taller than his uniform ever could. When she looked back up, her eyes swept the crowd before returning to him. "You've mistaken me for someone you could intimidate. But here's the truth. Your arrogance is no longer private, it's recorded. And when truth is recorded, arrogance has nowhere to hide." The words landed like a verdict. A murmur of agreement swelled through the waiting area. She's right. They can't cover this up. This is going viral. The officer's jaw tightened. He glanced at the cluster of passengers filming from every angle, then back at Elise, who remained unshaken. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. Behind him, the younger officer shifted again, clearly uncomfortable. "Sir, everyone's watching. Maybe we should call a supervisor." The crowd's voices grew bolder. "Call him now. Let her go. This is discrimination." Elise folded her hands in front of her, the very picture of composure. "Yes, call your supervisor, and while you're at it, notify Meridian's board of directors that their treatment of me today has already jeopardized their future." A businessman lowered his phone just enough to whisper to another traveler, "She's not bluffing. If she pulls her funding, that airline's finished." The weight of her words settled into the air, undeniable, inescapable. The officer's authority shrank under the gaze of dozens of witnesses and the unblinking eyes of 100 recording devices. Elise didn't raise her voice, didn't shout, didn't curse. She didn't need to. Her calm was her weapon, her identity her shield, her power her sword. And though the officer still stood before her, his grip already looked broken. Because everyone watching now knew the truth. The airline hadn't just laid hands on a passenger. They had insulted a woman whose signature moved billions, and the cost of that insult was about to become unbearable. The air around Gate 47 no longer felt like an ordinary waiting area. What had begun as an ugly scene between one officer and one woman had swelled into something larger, a gathering storm of voices, all eyes fixed on Elise and the man who still refused to step back. At first the sounds were scattered, whispers, gasps, muttered disbelief. But now the murmurs grew into words spoken louder, clearer, harder to ignore. A woman holding a stroller shook her head. "This isn't right. She gave him her ID. Everyone saw it." Another voice rose from the back. "He won't even read it because he doesn't believe it's hers." Phones hovered above heads, recording every angle. Screens glowed like evidence, each second captured, each insult stored for the world to see later. But some people weren't content with recording anymore. They began to speak. A businessman in a navy suit leaned forward, voice low at first, but gaining strength. "If she were white, none of this would have happened. Let's not kid ourselves." His words carried the weight of reluctant truth, and heads nodded in silent agreement. Near the boarding line, a black flight attendant paused in her duties, her expression heavy. She slipped closer, her voice barely above a whisper as she leaned toward Elise. "I'm so sorry," she said, eyes glistening. "This happens too often. We see it, but we're told to stay quiet." Elise turned her head slightly, acknowledging her with a steady gaze. That brief connection between two black women, one wielding global power, the other trapped in a uniform of obedience, was more profound than any speech. It was solidarity in silence, understanding in a glance. A young couple holding boarding passes began to speak up. The woman's voice trembled but carried conviction. She showed him everything. He just doesn't want to believe her. "Yes," her partner added quickly. "This is racial profiling, plain and simple." Their words made the officer's face tighten, but he stayed rooted, pride cementing him in place. The crowd grew restless. People shifted in their seats, some standing now, murmuring louder. The energy had changed, no longer just passive observation, but something closer to confrontation. The passengers weren't united, not all of them, but enough voices had broken the silence to make it dangerous for the airline. In the corner, an older woman clutched her pearls, muttering to no one in particular, disgraceful, treating her like a criminal in front of children. Zara, still seated near the corner of the waiting area, felt the words pulse through her chest. She wasn't alone in her outrage anymore. Strangers were finally saying out loud what she had been screaming inside her head. And yet, not everyone was ready to confront it. A man in a gray overcoat kept filming silently, his eyes darting nervously toward the officer, as if speaking might invite trouble his way. Another passenger, tapping furiously on his phone, muttered, "I'll post this later," but said nothing in the moment. Their silence stood in contrast to the growing chorus, a reminder that some people would always choose distance over courage. Elise remained poised, her silence deliberate. She didn't need to rush. Every second the officer stood there dismissing her. The narrative was writing itself through the mouths of witnesses. She was no longer just a victim of his aggression, she was proof of a deeper sickness, one that the crowd could no longer ignore. The businessman in the navy suit spoke again, louder this time, no longer caring who heard. "They dragged a billionaire like this in public. What does that say about how they'd treat the rest of us?" That question cracked something open. A ripple of agreement swept through the gate. Heads nodded, voices rose. The injustice had moved from being Elise's burden alone to a collective outrage the passengers now carried together. The officer finally shifted, his authority slipping. He glanced at the crowd, then back at Elise, as though realizing too late that his arrogance had been multiplied by every voice that chose to speak. And in that moment, before Elise even opened her mouth again, the public narrative had already begun to form. The cameras would show a black woman treated as disposable. The recordings would carry the whispers, the outrage, the admissions that this was about race, not procedure. And by the time the footage reached beyond the terminal walls, the airline's name would be carved into a story it could never erase. The voices around Gate 47 rose louder, but Elise remained steady, her presence commanding the space. The officer's authority had already cracked under the weight of witness outrage, yet he still hovered close, unwilling to admit defeat. Elise, however, no longer needed to confront him directly. She had a greater weapon in her hand, her phone. She reached calmly into her bag and pulled it out. With deliberate slowness, she unlocked the screen, her fingers steady. The crowd leaned in, sensing something pivotal was about to happen. She pressed a single button, and her assistant's voice came through, clear and professional. "Dr. Mensah, are you ready for the final call with Meridian's board?" Elise lifted her eyes to the passengers gathered around her. Their phones still filmed, their whispers swelling into anticipation. Then she spoke into the receiver, her tone calm, measured, but carrying like thunder across the waiting area. "Cancel the Meridian deal, effective immediately." Gasps filled the terminal. A man dropped his coffee cup, liquid splattering across the floor. The officer's smirk evaporated, confusion flashing across his face. He had thought he was handling a difficult passenger. Instead, he was watching the collapse of a multi-billion-dollar agreement unfold in real time. On the other end, her assistant hesitated, stunned. "Dr. Mensah, are you certain?" "Yes," Elise replied firmly, her voice steady enough for every recording device to capture. "Terminate negotiations. Withdraw all funding. Draft the statement tonight." She didn't lower her voice. She wanted every ear in that terminal to hear, every camera to record. She wanted the airline to feel the sting of their arrogance in the most public way possible. Passengers exchanged shocked looks. A young woman whispered, "Did she just say billions?" "She did," answered the man beside her, phone trembling in his hand. "She just pulled out of a $10 billion deal." Elise ended the call, slid the phone back into her bag, and turned her gaze toward the officer still frozen at her side. "Congratulations," she said softly, her words sharp enough to cut. "Your arrogance has cost your company more than you could ever earn in a lifetime." The murmurs grew into something louder now. A chorus of outrage blended with awe. People knew they were witnessing not just an act of racism, but its immediate consequence. Power meeting prejudice head-on. A grandmother near the gate clutched her chest, whispering, "She's teaching them a lesson they'll never forget." Elise bent once more, retrieving the leather folder that had spilled earlier, tucking the scattered papers neatly back into place. Then she stood again, her shoulders squared, her posture unbroken. Not once had she raised her voice, yet the weight of her decision reverberated across the entire terminal. The officer finally stepped back, his bravado drained, his jaw slack with disbelief. He had been certain he could humiliate her into compliance. Instead, she had stripped the airline of $10 billion with a single sentence. Travelers rushed to share what they had witnessed, typing furiously, posting footage to social platforms before Elise had even walked away. Hashtags formed instantly, spreading from phone to phone, the story escaping the walls of the terminal within seconds. Elise adjusted her scarf, her expression calm but unyielding. Around her the crowd buzzed, but she didn't need their validation. She had already sent her message, one louder than any protest, one more devastating than any confrontation. And as she turned toward the waiting area, her daughter's eyes met hers again. This time, Zara wasn't just terrified. She was awestruck. She had just watched her mother transform humiliation into power, pain into justice, silence into thunder. For the passengers who had doubted her, the lesson was sharp and unforgettable. And for the airline, whose name now carried shame across every recording, the cost had already begun to multiply. Because that call, made in the heart of a crowded airport, had cost them more than they could ever afford. The silence that followed Elise's phone call hung heavier than the boarding announcements echoing through the terminal. The officer shifted back, his posture no longer defiant, but defensive. His smirk was gone, replaced by the dawning realization that his arrogance had lit a fuse no one could extinguish. The crowd's murmurs built into a restless hum, every camera still fixed on Elise. It was at that moment the airport manager arrived, striding quickly through the gate area with 2 attendants trailing behind. His suit was wrinkled from haste, his face already flushed. He had been pulled from his office mid-call, summoned into a crisis that had already spun far beyond his control. "Dr. Mensah," he began, his voice pitching toward politeness but cracking at the edges. "Please, allow me to apologize on behalf of Meridian Airlines. This is all a misunderstanding. Security protocols sometimes appear." Elise lifted one hand, a gesture sharp enough to silence him. Her eyes met his with the kind of cold authority honed over decades in boardrooms. "Do not insult me by calling this a misunderstanding," she said. Her voice was steady, but it carried the weight of stone. This was not a procedure gone wrong. This was racism paraded as protocol. The manager faltered. We train our staff extensively, ma'am, but when reports come in, officers are required to—" "Racism is not a procedure," Elise cut in, each word deliberate, slicing through his excuses. "It is a disease, and your company has allowed it to spread unchecked." Gasps broke through the crowd, the words hitting harder than any raised voice could. The manager's face reddened further as he realized every syllable was being recorded, broadcasted by the dozen glowing screens surrounding them. He tried again, fumbling for ground. "If you just allow us to take this discussion to a private office." "No." Elise's refusal was instant. "You humiliated me in public. You will face accountability in public." Her words sent a ripple of approval through the crowd. Someone clapped once sharply before others joined in, the sound brief but undeniable. The manager's hands twitched nervously at his sides. He could feel control slipping through his fingers, every attempt to contain the damage drowned by the truth playing out in front of dozens of witnesses. The officer who had gripped Elise's hair shifted uncomfortably, his bravado entirely gone. He muttered something to the manager, but Elise cut through once more. "Don't whisper now. Say it to all of us. Explain why you thought a black woman with a valid boarding pass and government ID must be treated like a thief." He said nothing. His silence was louder than his earlier commands. The manager finally exhaled, shoulders slumping. "Dr. Mensah, I assure you, disciplinary measures will be taken immediately." "Not measures," Elise corrected sharply. "Consequences." Her words landed like a verdict. The crowd murmured louder now, passengers openly voicing agreement. "Yes, that's right. Hold them accountable." Elise folded her arms, her gaze unflinching. "By morning, your officers will be suspended. By morning, your resignation will be on the board's desk. And by morning, Meridian will face the reality of losing its largest private investment because it chose arrogance over dignity." The manager's mouth opened as if to argue, but no words came. He glanced at the cameras, at the crowd, at Elise standing immovable before him, and knew she was right. The story had already left the terminal. His career, like the officer's authority, had already collapsed under the weight of her calm. Passengers erupted into conversation, the tension shifting into something sharper, outrage mixed with admiration. A woman nearby whispered, "She didn't just defend herself, she took them all down in one move." Elise bent, adjusted the strap on her carry-on, and stood tall once more. "Your downfall," she said evenly, her voice cutting through the chatter, "began the moment you underestimated my silence." The manager lowered his eyes, the officer looked away, the witnesses kept recording. And by morning, just as Elise had promised, News broke that the officers had been suspended, the manager had resigned, and Meridian's stock had begun its steep fall. By the following afternoon, the world knew. Clips from Gate 47 had traveled across every platform, grainy footage, shaky angles, snippets of outrage. But the message was crystal clear. A black woman with wealth, power, and proof of her identity had been treated like a criminal in front of hundreds. Cameras flashed as Elise stepped to the podium at a downtown hotel, flanked not by security guards or executives, but by a row of young women in STEM programs her company sponsored. Their presence was deliberate. She wanted the world to see the future she invested in, standing behind her as witnesses to what dignity demanded. She began without apology, without softening her tone. Yesterday, at Meridian Airlines, I was assaulted by security personnel while attempting to board a flight. My credentials were dismissed, my identity was denied, my dignity was attacked. The room went silent. The only sound was the click of shutters and the hum of microphones capturing every word. Elise's gaze swept the crowd of reporters. This is not a misunderstanding. This is not an unfortunate error. This is racism, and racism is a betrayal of trust, of humanity, of the very principles corporations claim to uphold. Her words landed like blows, sharp and undeniable. She continued, her voice steady, deliberate. Williams Global Ventures was prepared to invest $10 billion into Meridian Airlines. Effective yesterday, that deal was withdrawn. That capital will be redirected into airlines and companies that demonstrate equity and accountability, not just in their marketing, but in their daily treatment of human beings. Gasps rippled through the press pool. Pens scratched furiously against notebooks. Phones buzzed with instant alerts. Reporters knew this wasn't just about one deal. It was about an industry forced to confront its sickness. Elise didn't falter. No boardroom presentation, no sustainability initiative, no corporate pledge matters if the human beings you serve are treated as disposable. We cannot build fleets for the future while dragging people backward into the prejudices of the past. Behind her, one of the young women shifted slightly, her eyes wide, awestruck. She was hearing not just a statement, but a declaration that would echo for years. A reporter shouted a question. Dr. Mensah, what do you hope comes from this? Elise leaned forward into the microphones. Change. Not apologies, not excuses. Change. Accountability is not optional. Dignity is non-negotiable. The room erupted in questions, but she had said all she needed to. She stepped back from the podium, leaving the words hanging, their weight heavier than any press release the airline could ever draft. Within hours, headlines circled the globe. Billionaire CEO pulls $10 billion from airline over racism incident. Dignity is non-negotiable, Elise Mensah speaks out. From assault to accountability, corporate America reckons with bias. For passengers who had stood silently at Gate 47, the press conference was a mirror. Their silence had allowed the moment to stretch, as long as it had. But Elise's response showed them what it looked like to push back. Not with raised fists, but with consequences corporations couldn't ignore. And for every young black girl scrolling through those headlines, seeing Elise's face beside words like power, dignity, refusal, it was more than a story. It was a lesson. Resilience wasn't just surviving humiliation, it was transforming it into justice. As the cameras dimmed and the press scattered, the lesson remained. What began as one woman's humiliation in an airport terminal had become a nation's wake-up call. Because when arrogance met silence, it thrived. But when arrogance met truth, and truth was recorded, it collapsed. And now I ask you, what would you have done in Elise's place? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Hit like, subscribe, and let the world know your voice.